Hey Larry, I just wanted to check in with everybody out there and see, last couple weeks we put out the step videos on our YouTube channel, and so far the feedback is pretty positive. Whether they agree or not is irrelevant. The idea is to make sure the stuff is out there for people who might need it, and to try to present it in an accessible way for each of you out there and for myself as well. So when we were talking on those videos, I mentioned codependency several times, and I also made mention to coming back and doing a video about codependency. Now, of course, this is not going to be the be-all and end-all about the concept of codependency, but what I hope to do again is simply give you some tools, give you some ideas that you can maybe work on with yourself, by yourself, or with your mentor or whoever you have that you're working with, maybe just a friend. Either way, it's all good. We're just going to try to talk about something that is so common in humans that we really would be remiss not to talk about it in terms of its connection to addiction and recovery, mental health and recovery. And some people even think that codependency is its own addiction. And I'm not going to argue with that. I'm going to present actually some ideas that might lend to the idea that it is an addiction, another singular potential addiction. Now, the addiction wouldn't be necessarily to codependency itself, but to a person or relationship. So, however, you can determine whether that means codependency is an addiction or not, because I don't know. What I do know is that codependency affects most of us in one way or another. Now, it's not always going to be in a huge way, like it's not going to necessarily ruin everybody's life, right? Like most of us have characteristics of codependency within our character, within our personalities. It's basically just how we've learned to live with other humans, right? And in some cases, what we've learned is not necessarily healthy. I don't know if it's necessarily bad or good, but it's definitely not healthy where I'm coming from. So, codependency. What is codependency? Okay, well, a person defines themselves or their worth based on another person or the relationship with another person. Okay, so my identity would be wrapped up in the person I'm with or the relationship itself. And see, some people think that the relationship itself is about the other person, but it's not. Okay, the relationship is actually about the codependent. That's what the relationship's about what the codependent can do for the other person to take away some of the other person's difficulties, right? So obviously enabling is wrapped up in codependency. We want to enable the other people in our lives so that we don't have to be the bad guys. They can be the bad guys. We can punish them when they're not the good guys. All kinds of things get wrapped up into codependency. But that's the essence of it, okay? The beginning of the essence. So codependence will naturally, and honestly, I have to say this is probably, I don't know what the percentages are, but whether you're aware of it or not is relevant, okay? Because if you don't know your pattern, then you don't know it. But once we see it, then we can actually work with it. So if this is a part of maybe your pattern, I know it was a part of mine. Back when I was really young, long before I sobered up, but even into the beginning of my sobriety. And along the way, I am still dealing with this. But it's not as bad today as it was, obviously, in the beginning of sobriety or prior to coming in. So this was definitely my MO for a long time before I came in. I would choose people who either needed rescuing or fixing, or who I felt were in need of me, whatever that was. I'm not sure I ever thought, oh, I'm going to rescue that person. But however it translated in my head, that's exactly what it equaled in my life. Like, that's what I was doing. I was choosing people specifically who needed fixing, right? And by who needed fixing, who I determined needed fixing. That's another part of codependency. The other person is not responsible for how I choose to interact with them. I am responsible for that. So one of the things we're going to really hammer away at in terms of codependency is being honest with yourself and with the other person, okay? Now, honesty doesn't always mean we just like flat out bluntly give people shit. That's not what this is about, right? What we're trying to realize is the honesty it's going to take here to tell whether we're acting in a unhealthy codependent manner in our relationships. That's where the honesty comes in to self, right? Because one of the things that happens with it is we can start to think that we're fine. This is what we're supposed to be doing for other people. And our brain, as we talked about in the other videos with the steps, our brain will rationalize, justify, and motivate us to continue to do this. Of course, our brain's not also telling us this is harmful. What our brain's telling us is this is what we need to do in order to be with the person or have the relationship we've dreamt of having, right? Which, of course, that's not true, okay? So one of the reasons why codependents like to pick people who they can fix, who they can rescue, who they can help hide the symptoms of whatever they're going through, is to become indispensable, okay? A codependent loves to be thought of as indispensable. Okay, so I don't want to burst anybody's bubble right now, but I'm pretty sure most of us can reasonably assume that anything we do can be done by someone else. Okay? Anything we do can be done by someone else. And that is not a knock on us. Okay? It's not. But one of the parts of denial is to actually believe we could become indispensable for another human because we can't control their will. Right? So we could become indispensable if we could control what that other person needed, wanted, when they wanted it, all that stuff, but we can't, right? So becoming indispensable in another human's life is very difficult, okay? It's very difficult and obviously frustrating because most people never achieve it, okay? Indispensable is something that I used to tell myself because of my arrogance. When I was living this way, whether it was with work, because it happens in work too, it was with work, with a woman, with friends, whatever it is, there was a period in time where I believed, specifically at work for me, that I was indispensable. But the reality is, I was not, right? I wasn't indispensable. When I quit, it didn't stop the world from moving, right? Or when I left those people that I was codependent with, it didn't stop them from doing all the things that they were going to do, right? In fact, it probably helped give them some motivation to continue to do those things that maybe I found unsavory, right? But the idea of codependency is, or part of the idea is, I don't know where I end and where that other person begins, right? That was the biggest difficulty for me when I was acting in this way. It would absolutely cloud my identity. Obviously, because we define ourselves, our worth, based on the other person or that relationship that happens with them, right? Always not realizing that the person in these relationships becomes irrelevant, okay? It's not that we don't like the person all of a sudden, it's not that we don't care about them, but the person becomes irrelevant to our own behavior in this relationship, right? Because our behavior in this relationship is always going to be pushed on the other person for validation, right? And, oh my God, we're going to get into some exciting stuff, right? So, what are some common sayings with codependence? Darcy, what do you think a common saying is with codependence? You can't read that. You guys can't see him, but he's cheating.
I honestly don't know. I don't know what common phrases of codependency are because I've never really studied it. So.
Oh, okay, good. That's good.
So I'm learning.
Okay, so here's one, and then you can tell me as we go along if you can think of any other ones. That's good to know, right? Because we want to know who we're talking to. So one of the most common sayings that I used to say, and that I've heard from other partners in my life who are codependent, I don't understand why he, she refuses to change. I do everything for them, okay? I elongated that because that sentence is problematic, okay? And you can all probably see why that is problematic if it was in your life. First of all, we cannot force change. We can almost, we think, okay, especially in a relationship, we think we can control and manipulate, however, the process of change, right? We believe as codependents, we start to actually take on the idea that we can do this. That if that person would only listen to us, then they would be better off. Another saying I used to say, right? If only that my partner would do what I thought was best, we'd be fine, right? But the reality is that's never going to work, right? Because I cannot control someone else's will. I cannot make them change, right? Now I absolutely can try to force compliance, right? I can force compliance by other manipulative tools, lying, justifying, rationalizing, arguing. I can try to force compliance through those other unhealthy behaviors that I have in order to get that change. But the change is an illusion because it usually does not last, right? Most people don't recover at the whim of someone else, right? We may go to treatment because of it. I've met lots of men and women who go to treatment because of it and they don't stay together after the fact, or they resent the person who tried to force change them, right? And that's dangerous because how are we going to keep in love as we're changing if we don't recognize what's happening, right? Because lots of us will get into these relationships and then we'll sober up and think everything's going to be fine, right? What happens actually when we sober up is codependency becomes more obvious, right? Now, codependency becomes more obvious because there's nothing else clouding what we're doing, right? We're not drinking, we're not using, maybe we're not like using sex or porn or any of that stuff. Now, we're in a nice relationship with somebody and we think, well, that's my thing. I am going to spend so much time, okay, looking at what that other person is doing that I'm going to totally forget what I'm supposed to do. And that is a very common thing that happens in recovery relationships of any time period. This isn't just about being new or having time or new versus having time. This is like, there's people who have never looked at their codependency in recovery, right? There's people who will never. And that is absolutely okay. The reason I am forced to is because it's a detriment to my life, right? So it's a detriment to my life each day that I wake up and I realize that, well, it's not a detriment as much anymore. I shouldn't say that. It's not like if I'm codependent today, I'm going to die. I don't feel that way. But what happened, it's detriment to my relationships. That's what it's a detriment to. Because if I don't pay attention to where I end and other people start, I start thinking that other people should be doing what I want, right? Even though I haven't said anything, which is another thing of codependency, is that we don't always tell you what our boundaries are, right? We have a, back in the day I was pretty well known, I think, for assuming people would be able to read my mind because my face is so obvious that I'm upset. So obviously the other person should just figure it out. That's another thing that I used to say all the time. Why can she never figure out why I'm so upset? Right? Well, I'm going to tell you a little hint. One thing that my brain kept from me for a long time. I never said those fucking things out loud. So in a lot of respects, I never did. I would, and I didn't find this out when I was still living out there drinking and shit. It was through time and exposure to other people in sobriety that I realized, oh my God, I was doing all of these things, right? So another one of our sayings is, you can't help this variations of this, right? You can't help someone that won't help themselves. I used to say that all the time. However, usually I would follow it by a but. But in this case, I'm going to, but I can, right? Can you sense the arrogance that comes out of me when I think that, even just say that out loud, right? I can. Now, you can't, Darcy, but I can, right? So there's so much arrogance wrapped up in codependency that I feel like if we all just kind of agreed that it was arrogance in codependency, lots of us would just stop doing it. Lots of you, I should say. For me, it's ingrained. I have to continuously work at it, but it's getting better, right? It's getting better to the point where I'm actually willing to have conversations with my partner, with my friends about things that maybe we don't agree on, right? But it's okay. However, if I'm codependent, every time we fight, we're breaking up, okay? So if you haven't experienced that feeling where every time there's a little bit of a disagreement, oh, we're over. That's what my life was like back in the day. I would be like this. We would get into an argument, and it's usually about the 2.5, 3 month time period when people start to figure out each other just a little bit, and that's when I would leave, right? Was because then the criticism started. And I couldn't take criticism to save my life because I thought if you criticized me, we were breaking up, right? Because codependency, much like other addictions, is it gives your brain the sense that everything is black and white, right? That even though Darcy might not understand what my expectations are, he should, right? And that if he doesn't, I get to punish him for that. I get to, right? I get to criticize him for not being attentive to my needs, even though I may not have said anything out loud, right? So some of these things are really changing. I guess the idea is that sometimes it changes slow, right? Or we think we should be better than this already, right? You know what? You might be right. Like, maybe I should have learned about codependency when I was a teenager. I probably could have, right? I probably could have paid attention to things. But the reality is that when I was a teenager, I was trying not to fucking die, right? Like, from myself, from taking my own life. And that is when I started to realize all of the things that had happened to me as a child, right? They started to come to the surface through my teen years. And so in order to avoid that, what was coming to the surface, I chose relationships and people, right? Now, none of those relationships worked out, obviously, right? Because very few of them will, especially if, now I think some of the longer term ones probably have a better chance of turning around, right? But when you first meet someone, and in the first 3 months, I have to be honest with you, I don't compromise a lot in the first 3 months. Because the reality of that is that compromise is going to be asked for forever, right? And by compromise a lot in the first few months, I mean, I'm not an asshole. Well, I might be an asshole sometimes. Yeah, you just have to ask Heather. I can be an asshole. But I try not to be an asshole, and I try not to hold other people accountable for what I'm thinking, right? But codependency isn't logical, okay? This is where there might be a little bit of a blur between whether it's an addiction of its own or not, right? Is because it does not follow logic. It actually follows a similar pattern. As I was listening to a speaker talk about it, it really does follow a similar pattern of alcohol abuse and drug abuse, right? Is because you start to obsess, okay? So have you ever been in a relationship with someone that every time you were apart, you were just worried, you were anxious, you were depressed, but then when you come back together, you'd be fine. And you probably thought, oh, that's weird. I must have been just nervous or scared that the person was going to get hurt. Unless it happens every time they go to work, right? Or every time they go out with their friends, or every time they go out here, right? And so, of course, it can awaken jealousy. And the jealousy is not even necessarily about anyone else touching us. The jealousy starts to become about other people meeting their needs, right? Because we're indispensable if we can meet their needs. So when other people meet their needs, we might even get we might act overtly jealous, right? But really what we're trying to do, again, jealousy is a mechanism of control. So we're trying to control the other person, what they do, what they say, what they think, all that kind of stuff. And I know it seems far-fetched, but codependency will burn a relationship to the ground just as fast as getting drunk, right? Just as fast, especially if we just give into it and ride it out. And that's coming from someone who's done that, given into it, rid it out, and said, yeah, okay, that was fun, right? And then 2.5, 3 months later, boop, gone, right? Because you can do that. That's how I was able to stay codependent for so long, was because I kept jumping from people to people to people to people, right? So I don't have to be myself, right? And that's something that has to change for me. It had to change, okay? So we may need to relearn our ideas of what helping is. Okay, so codependent thinks helping is you do it for them. You set everything up for them. You make the appointments for them. That is not interdependence. That's codependence, right? What happens when we get interdependent is maybe I say, Darcy, I need some help. And Darcy says, what do you need help with? And I tell him what I need help with. And he has resources. Help in that scenario would be Darcy sharing the resources with me. Okay, not calling them on my behalf. Okay, not going in and visiting them and finding out all the information for me. No, because I need to do that. I need to call in. I need to ask for the information. See, that's the difference. The difference is, here in codependency, I'm going to go ahead and keep doing everything I've always done, instead of trying to set up some boundaries, right? So like if Darcy was asking me for help, I would do the same thing that I would hope Darcy would do. I would say, what's the problem? You would tell me the problem. And then if there was resources that I knew about, I would absolutely share those resources with you. But I'm not going to call for you. I'm not going to set up an appointment for you, right? That's the difference. And it's because there's a lot of things going on there. But the main reason is because I believe Darcy can handle himself, right? So I believe Darcy can pick up the phone. I believe Darcy can talk a good talk and get what he needs when he's talking. I believe that wholeheartedly. However, if I say that to him, but then I call anyway, and then I make the appointment anyway, and then I make some weird requirements for Darcy to go through with this, that's me getting in the way, right? Because I want Darcy to do what I want, right? Otherwise, he might do something someone else wants, and he might like that better, and then I'm really nervous, right? So codependency, you can see how in its extreme versions would be crippling, right? Like crippling to a person in a relationship. I think one of the most, or some of the most reasonable examples in my life were just constantly trying to control what happened in the relationship. And it wasn't as though I was worried about person leaving or any of that stuff. God, no. It was always like, I just wanted to control the leaving. That was my mentality, right? So if I could control the leaving, then I was safe, right? And of course, I was always safe. I was never disappointed controlling the leaving, right? Because I was always the one leaving. So lack of ability to be vulnerable. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. So we might have to relearn. Sorry if I keep standing up, man. Is that bugging the... Okay. So sometimes we're going to have to relearn what helping means. And the reason we have to relearn it is because our helping has been caught up in obsession, powerlessness, unmanageability, and craving. Like I continually craved another person to take care of, right? Another person to fix or help or whatever I wanted to use as my words, right? So codependents, we absolutely experience the same things that you experience with drug or alcohol abuse and addiction, right? Is we experience the obsession, the time that we're apart, all I do is obsess about the partner. And I'm not obsessing about whether or not she's with somebody else, because honestly, was never really my problem. It was always, she's gonna leave me. She's gonna leave me. It had nothing to do with anybody else. So the obsession was, how do I control her from leaving now that she's finding out that I'm kind of a rotten human, right? Because that's how I felt, that I was a rotten human. Nobody wanted to get to know a rotten human. So when they started to get to know me for real, I would just bail, right? But in the meantime, I would act as though their existence was the very cradle of civilization that I lived on, right? They were basically there. I would make them feel that way, but it was not real, right? Because it's an illusion. I cannot give somebody love properly if all they want is to use me, or if all I want is to use them. That's not love, right? So I'm not suggesting I didn't like those women or even love a couple of them. Pretty sure I did love a couple of them, right? And that's fine. But the reality is my love was so unhealthy and tainted with codependency, it was more so just toxicity, right? So when I talk about some of that, not toxic because those people were toxic, but I was toxic, right? And some of them were toxic too. I mean, when you roll around with people who are fucked up, chances are we're all fucked up a little bit, right? And you know, it's really hard, but someone said this to me, I think it was before sobriety or early sobriety, but some woman like just picked up on it like right away, hey? And she was like, how did she put it? Oh, she said something like, I don't want to be your obsession because that looks dangerous. And I kind of shrugged and was like, huh, all right, whatever. And then I moved on. But it's the idea, right? Even in that time frame of like 1 or 2 months, people were kind of like, whoa. Healthy people definitely say what that woman said to me, right? I don't want to be a part of your like collapse here, right? I don't want to be a part of your sick little shit that's going on. Anyway, so is codependency an addiction? Sure, right? I mean, if anything can be an addiction, which they can be if it's in excess, right? Or it's continued and then this starts to happen, life starts to get unmanageable, right? You start to crave people who are toxic. So people who say, oh, I just like chaos. Yeah, I know. I did too. So I kept craving people who were living in chaos because I knew I could probably try to fix them a little bit. They let me get a little bit in there and I could tool around a little bit and then they'd get mad and leave. Or they'd get mad, I'd get mad because they wouldn't change and then I'd leave, right? So anyway, here are some of the things that we use in order to control partners when we're not going to use violence, because that was never something that was for me in terms of partners. So this is non-sustainable. Whether we are looking at codependency, drug addiction, or alcoholism, it's non-sustainable. The outcome is the same. That illness will destroy exactly what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because that's all it can do. This does not lead to peacefulness. This does not lead to peacefulness unless we understand and process the fact that, yeah, you know what, we are powerless over other people, places, and things, right? But if we're going to be in denial about all these things, denial changes the game, right? Because if we get here and we start looking at our codependency and then we go, oh yeah, but it's not that bad, or it wasn't that bad, or it wasn't this, it wasn't that, which is fine because maybe it wasn't, right? But if it is bad, then we want to like try to get away from denial and look at the facts, right? So once we start looking at the facts, what are the things we do, right, in terms of living in a codependency relationship? Well, we use over control mechanisms sometimes. Okay, we'll manipulate, we'll be dishonest, we become demanding, we justify our demands, we then rationalize why we did what we did, we rationalize why we keep trying to help, right? So we do lots of those things, and if we leave, if that person leaves, every time they leave, we go through a little bit of a withdrawal. That's why I felt so bad sometimes, right? It made sense to me. We feel some withdrawal symptoms. Because if they're not going to behave the way that we are encouraging them to behave, this is what I'm going to feel, right? I'm going to feel physical, mental, emotional withdrawal when you leave, right? And that's what drove me so crazy in between times, right? It's like you have this greatest love, this intimacy, you know, you've met this girl like a week before and you're in love and there's so much intimacy. And then every time you're not with the girl or the guy, you're just like anxious and freaking out. Well, it's because you want some control back, right? It's like the drug left. It's like your drug walked away, right? Anyway, that was something definitely for me that I felt was some definite physical, I could hit depression almost instantly if there was like a disconnect. My depression would just flood into me. So anxiety and depression went apart, and of course it could go into other things too. It's not just going to be anxiety and depression, but those are the two most consistent ones that kind of come up when that other is away or not doing what we wish, right? Is that deep sense of like of loss almost, right? Like almost like we've already lost the relationship because they're not doing what we want or they left, right? How come they didn't know I was struggling? Because I didn't tell them. That's the first clue, right? I had to be sure that when I was, nowadays, I try to be sure before I open my mouth, right? And address something that needs to be addressed. I try to be sure of where I'm coming from, right? And in terms specifically, codependency stuff, right? Because if I'm going into this conversation with my partner and I'm going to be dishonest, well, I might as well stop right there, right? Because that's going to lead me to other things. If I'm dishonest, then I'm going to start doing other behaviors like leaving, disconnection, avoidance. I'm going to start getting into all kinds of stuff once I start lying. That's my pattern, right? So, or one of my patterns anyway. Okay, so we obsess, we become hypervigilant to the other's behaviors. We're constantly trying to rescue, fix, and hide what the other person's doing because we think that's helping, right? So we need to like look at helping differently. Okay? Look at helping differently. Whatever that looks like for you, right? In terms of what you do in your daily life, what your friends do, whoever this might be about for you, we take the lack of others changing personally, right? Because we've tried to make it happen for them, so if it doesn't happen, it's our fault. So once we take away someone else's right to self-determination as to what they need to change, what they are looking to do, once we try to take that away from them, all we're left with is a lot of frustration, okay? Because they first of all, they'll never live up to it. They'll never live up to what we're hoping for, even if we think what we're hoping for is realistic. Because there's a part of our hopes, I say hopes, but I'm not sure that's the right word, in the other person, that it will be okay, that they're going to listen to us eventually. But of course, it leads to more and more frustration because we can never control someone else's will. We just can't, okay? We start to take on the illusion that we can, and that's part of the problem, is that illusion. So we'll experience all kinds of things in a codependent relationship. But of course, most likely are some of these, right? We'll start losing our interests, right? And that was something I remember from the early days prior to sobriety, or late days of using and drinking was, it was early sobriety, I got into more loss of interest stuff. Because I didn't really have many interests before sobering up, except for working, having sex, and drinking and using. Like, that was literally my life at that point. Or what I hoped was my life, right? That's what I wanted. So once I sobered up though, and I was sober for a period of time, I started to realize that my codependency symptoms were constantly acting up, right? So speaking of the loss of interest, like one of my first girlfriends in sobriety, neither of us were really trustworthy. We were both practicing together before we sobered up, right? So neither of us were super trustworthy. I believe we probably liked each other a lot, right? Maybe even loved each other for what we were capable of, but I'm not sure about that. The reality is that I lost interest in other things, right? I started losing interest in other things. Probably the best example of a codependent relationship for me was long before I sobered up, with a woman who basically acted 100% as though they were the user. And then I acted 100% as the codependent. So I was the codependent, the person was the user, even though that person didn't use illegal drugs. They used drugs, just not illegal ones. It was still using. And so my aunt, she was an asshole. And she was mean, and she was cruel, and she took 100% advantage of the fact that I was codependent. 100%. But I don't blame her for that. That's on me. Because I knew that I was losing my interests, my friends, my family, my social engagements, all that stuff was starting to go by the wayside because she demanded all my attention, right? And by demanded, I mean demanded sometimes, but also the illusion was that she was demanding my attention. Because what happens in my mind as a codependent was I was unable to see exactly what I was doing, but I was 100% able to see what she was doing, right? Because, like we talked about, my focus was almost 100% on her, right? And there were lots of reasons, I thought, in order that I needed to do that. But the reality is, that relationship ended anyway. All the things I was trying to not mention, not talk about in order to stay there in that relationship, which, honestly, looking back, I don't even know why I wanted to be. It was terrible. But that's me looking back at it with healthier eyes, saying, I would not wish that on anyone, that kind of relationship, because it was just darkness, right? So that's probably the extreme example of me at my codependent peak, because after her, I definitely started paying much less attention, right, to those things. And I stopped wanting to be involved in the other person's life all the time, because I thought if I was going to be involved in their life, why wouldn't they listen to me when I tell them how they should live it, right? So obviously that's a sick perspective, right? But this was all present during that relationship. And my drug of choice 100% became her and our relationship. I'm going to say our relationship because I don't remember thinking super highly of her towards the end, but I was still trying to hold on to the relationship. Because once that relationship goes, I've got nothing else to focus on, right? Because I wasn't ready to look at myself and all the things that I needed to do, right? So that's probably another reason why it was so heightened, that codependency at that time. Okay, so my drug of choice was a person or a relationship. Okay, the only time I felt whole was when she was giving me comfort, right? Was when she was comforting me, talking to me about our relationship and how much she needed me and all that kind of stuff, right? I don't know if that hits anybody in the fields, but that's what it was like for me, right? I would feel whole when she was there, and whenever she wasn't around, I would just be desperate. Like, it was so strange how deep I went down there. Now, obviously, I went really deep, partly because I was still practicing in terms of drinking and some drugs. Not much drinking at that time, if I'm honest. Like, I wasn't drinking a whole lot. But that was mostly because she would know, right? Like, she was pretty smart about that stuff, pretty savvy. I say savvy instead of smart. Yeah, I like that better. She was savvy. Okay? But then there was that torn apart feeling. And until I was like clear of that relationship for a period of time, I wasn't quite sure that that's what it was, right? But of course, as time goes on and in recovery now, the idea is that there's just no way to sustain that kind of relationship, right? Sorry, I gotta go back for 1 second here. Okay. Yeah, the torn apart feeling. That was the feeling I could remember feeling the most in that relationship. I felt torn apart most often, or depressed, right? And so that's obviously a sign things aren't great, right? When you're doing all this crazy shit and the other person's basically careless about your feelings. It's so strange to be there, and I'm embarrassed a little bit remembering having been there, and having been there more than once. Not as bad as the one I'm talking about, but having been there more than once, it gets embarrassing, right? So for me, I just really want to try to continue to get a little better when it comes to that and other things that I do. So what can we do about codependency? Well, one of the first things we need to do is, first of all, get honest about how we actually interact, right? Determine, maybe do a step 1 on that in terms of a person, place, or thing. And if you need help with that, ask around or even contact us. But what we're gonna try to do is create and maintain and adjust our boundaries, okay? And first we have to create them. So in order to create something, you have to realize what's lacking, right? So one of the ways that we create them is we start to look at our boundaries as though whether they're weak, clear and strong, or rigid, okay? So what we're looking for, obviously in my mind, I'm always trying to go here, okay? I want to go clear and strong. I don't want to have weak or none, sorry, I left that one out, none or weak boundaries. I want clear, strong boundaries, right? And I don't want to get to rigid. When I get to rigid, people get smacked in the mouth for trying to hug me. And that's not okay, right? Like, that's not okay. So, Darcy, what's a boundary of yours that would be considered weak? Or just not clear, however you want to describe it.
It's the way people talk to me, I guess, maybe. Or, yeah, like I have a boundary, but they didn't mean it that way.
Oh, okay, exactly.
So,
yeah.
Just giving people credit, like leeway on their tone of voice, the way they talk,
Yeah.
whether they're snappy. So.
Yeah, but that might be a clear one too, right? That might be clear, and then when you figure it out, it becomes either rigid or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and some of them will do that. Some of our boundaries will fluctuate from one side to the other, sometimes resting here, but sometimes here and here as well, right?
It's like depending on your mood, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're foul mood and somebody crosses that line, and suddenly it's rigid.
This is exactly what the point is that if it's clear, the mood won't matter.
Yeah.
That's the idea, right? The idea is so that we can get into a place of our boundaries and our understanding of what they are so that we don't have to snap or ignore it, right? We want to try to maintain or build and maintain clear, strong boundaries so that we can just simply say no if we mean no. It doesn't have to be a big production, right? It's what it's all about is saying no and sticking to it, or saying yes and sticking to it, okay? Now obviously here, if I say yes, yes, yes to someone who's always asking the same question and my real answer is no, this is where I'm going to fall. I'm going to fall here, and the result will be frustration, anger, distrust, because see, I'm going to start thinking here, even though I haven't told you necessarily what they are, I'm going to start feeling like you're not listening to me, even though I haven't spoken, right? The brain is a strange place to go by yourself. Don't go there if you don't have to by yourself, especially when you're dealing with some of this kind of stuff, right? It can be hard to look at because most of us have like absolute liabilities in our character and stuff. I know I do. Okay, but this is going to lead here and then potentially to the disillusion, or I can't spell that, so loss of relationship. Whatever that relationship was. Eventually the frustration, the anger mounts, we snap. Over here, same thing, except it doesn't mount. Over here is just a snap. Okay? When it's like, I told you I don't fucking like shaking hands, you keep trying to shake my fucking hand, right? That's pretty rigid. For me, that's rigid. In order to be clear, what I would do is stop approaching that person. Because that's clear to me. I'm telling myself, I don't have to put up with that stuff. I don't have to put up with someone who doesn't listen to me, right? So I won't. In a clear place, I just simply won't even notice. I won't engage. It'll be like, no, my boundary is, I'm good, right? I'm good over here. So having the clear and some strong boundaries is going to make it easier for us to simply say no if we mean no, and yes if we mean yes, right? Also, we'll stop making other people responsible for us once we start developing and maintaining some clear boundaries. Because we're going to start to realize through the process of doing this work that we have no control over someone else. That we can't control their will, we can't control them. They're changing, we can't control anything about it. I think it's 3 C's. We didn't cause it, we can't cure it. Cause, cure, control. That's it. We didn't cause it, we can't control it, and we can't cure it or change it. Those things. Depending on how what your idea is, it's 3 C's. Okay? Change, cure, control. Oh no, sorry, we didn't cause, we can't cure, and we can't control. Those are the 3 C's. Okay? Or 3 C's, as how I see it. If we can keep this in mind, when we're interacting, trying to develop these clear, strong boundaries, and trying to get away from none or weak and rigid into a place of flexibility. So here's the thing that Darcy was talking about earlier. In terms of mood, right? Flexibility comes in here. I become flexible with my boundaries. I start to become discerning. And really, that's what it is. We can be discerning, right? About which boundaries are for who. Because they're not going to be the same for everybody, right? I'm going to see when this whole isolation thing and social distancing is over, I'm absolutely going to be okay going back to hugging my friends. 100%. I'll be okay with that. Okay? Am I going to be 100% okay with hugging people in meetings around town? Probably not. I'll be honest with you. Unless I've known them for a long time, right? The reason is because this isolation business has kind of outlined where I have gone beyond what I'm comfortable with in some places, right? So example is hugs. It's a good example because my dad's a hugger, like mom's a hugger, champion of huggers, right? And so as a son of them, part of me feels responsible to continue to hug, right? Although, as I get older, I realize that's not good because I don't like it. I don't like hugging everybody. So I'm going to be honest with you. I don't like it. So what I'm working on, see, we're constantly working. What I'm really working on is not doing that stuff anymore, right? Whether it be a handshake or a hug. Because the reality is, I don't like everybody. I don't want to pretend that I like everybody. I don't want to even pretend that I am there in the same capacity for everyone. Because I can't be. You can't be. Right? Now at a meeting, different story. Okay, we're not going there just for ourselves. However, we absolutely need to maintain these boundaries. If I advise females specifically, because they're usually the ones who have concerns about these boundaries being crossed at meetings, right? So we always talk about just be here in the clear. If you don't want to, say no. If you're okay, say yes. There's absolutely nothing wrong with hugging. It's just as long as you want to hug, right? So obviously times have changed. So now more people say, is it okay if I hug you? And that's something that I will do as well. And so now when people have said that, I have said, no, I'm good, right? So that's good. That's like progress, but it's all about progress. Because there's still some people I hug and like, I grin, and in my head, I'm just like, fuck you. And then I walk away, right? But it's most of the time, it's probably because I just deeply instinctively feel that they need a hug. But that's codependency, right? Because I'm acting on their needs, not my own. So try to just keep that in mind, right? So boundaries are not easy to build, okay? And they're even harder to maintain, especially with people we love. The reason they're hard is because we think we're being rude by telling somebody no, right? And when I say we, I mean me, right? This was a big part of my life, was trying to appease things around me. Now, there was another reason why I was doing it for a long time, or why I thought I was doing it, was because people acted afraid of my anger. They acted afraid of my truth. So in terms of avoiding people being afraid of me, I adopted lots of codependent strategies as I grew up, right? So in terms of that, that's what I'm dealing with. That's what I'm unraveling, right? So when we're building boundaries, try to look at the types of boundaries that you might need. There's physical, sexual, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, there's probably even more. Social, who knows? You can make this as comprehensive as you want. But in terms of like sexual, and this is a problem sometimes for people who are in relationships who feel they owe their partner sex, right? And because I work in the field of recovery and addiction and mental health, obviously a lot of people I work with, not everybody out there of course, but lots of people I work with are struggling with this stuff, right? They've struggled with it their whole life, the physical and the sexual, in terms of letting other people in and take advantage of them, or vice versa, taking advantage of others, because if I have no boundaries, I am also assuming you have no boundaries. So I am probably going to be all over it back in those days, right? Anyway, however, we need to be honest. Okay? We need to be honest about where we have allowed people to cross our boundaries and continue to do it. We start with being honest, then we ask for help, how to do it, like what are we supposed to do now, okay? But honestly, it starts with no. To build a boundary starts with no, okay? No. I'm going to say no when this happens. I'm just going to say no when this happens. A simple thing. If this happens, I'm saying no. This is my no. Now, we're going to have things, some things are going to be bottom lines in boundaries and relationships and codependency. We're going to have bottom lines with people, right? Like, bottom line with a partner might be for somebody, that person will only sleep with them, right? That's not a bottom line for me, but that is bottom line for lots of people, right? The bottom lines for me are more about disrespect, dishonesty, control, that kind of stuff. But I have very few bottom lines. The reason I have few bottom lines is because I want to be open to working with whatever's presented to me, right? Now, bottom lines, there are some, right? Like if my partner starts calling me names and swearing at me and shit, I'm probably not going to hang around, right? And by probably, I mean you'll see a Dave-sized hole in the wall, right? Because that's what I've done and that's what I'll do, right? I'm not going to take that shit. Because there's too much work going on in our lives, especially if we dig into the work, to go backwards into that. So we ask for help, because most of us, if you come from a place of no boundaries or super rigid ones, I have no idea what to do in the beginning. No idea. I have no idea that it was no or yes. Those are simple boundaries. And if we can simplify it for ourselves, then all the better, right? Now, this is not an easy process to build these boundaries, especially with people we are already engaged with, interacting with. It's hard to introduce new boundaries to old relationships, right? It's hard, not impossible. It's imperative. Because if relationships don't grow as you grow, right, then those relationships are bound to just kind of go away, right? So the only way it can grow is if we're honest with each other. And of course, this is still a problem for me. Now, not the being honest part, but understanding what it is I'm feeling sometimes. That's difficult, right? So I don't always know right away what boundary might have been crossed, or if a boundary at all was crossed. Because instantly when there's conflict, I go into this like, okay, don't yell, don't smash nothing. I go into this like, just take it easy, just breathe. So it takes a minute for me to figure out what's going on, right? And the best thing I could do there though, is be honest about that with the person I'm involved with, which I try to be. I'm not doing well right now, I don't know how I'm feeling, I need some time. But that's a boundary, okay? Is needing time is a boundary. When you say that, unless, of course, I say, I need time from you, Darcy, and then just continue hanging out with Darcy, right? This is a troubling thing that will happen to me if I'm moving along those lines and not following up on what I need, right? So once I identify a need, then it's a little bit simpler, right? Especially with people you've known for a while, but even in a relationship, there's constantly stuff that needs to be reintroduced. And that's something I forget all the time. I think that if we talked about it once, it should be fine. But that's because chances are I've moved on and I forgot about it already, right? Until it comes up again, right? So, but then when it comes up again, you can always talk about it again. That's the trouble. I try not to be afraid to speak. Right? Now, I say that. I say try not to be afraid to speak. I write don't be afraid to speak. Realizing 100% that some of us have never been allowed to speak. Okay? Or we've never felt okay to speak. So this is the stuff we're going to have to learn. Right? The process, okay? It's a process. It takes time. Probably the way I'm going to leave this is I'm going to leave probably one of the most important things in my mind about this is about building boundaries and codependency is whatever we do, try and make it sustainable, okay? Because if it's not sustainable, so if it's like that knee-jerk reaction boundary, which is usually rigid, is you'll never do that again, okay? Is that sustainable? Are you willing to leave if they do it again? Are you willing to get into a conversation and change your ways if they're going to do it again? Like, what is sustainable, right? So I'm not a big fan of giving people ultimatums or demanding stuff, but that's because it doesn't work, okay? That's why I'm not a fan of it. Giving people ultimatums will only gain compliance, and it's only brief, right? Compliance is not change. Compliance is compliance. Compliance means I'm equally afraid of losing you as you are of me, therefore I'll try to do what you want, only insofar as it gets you off my back. Not insofar as me actually changing. Okay? So that's, lots of times that gets confused for us. We actually think people should want to change for us. And you know what? People will want to change for us. In some respects, especially if they like us. And we'll change as a result of our connection to others in a healthy, more natural way, right? It's not about us influencing each other or not influencing. We are always influencing each other, always. When someone asks me my opinion on something, I'm very careful because I could possibly influence them, right? Or I try to be careful. Unless it's on a podcast, then I'm not as careful because our podcast is a way that I get to kind of like unhinge a bit, let go of some of my stress and my pent-up frustration from whatever else is going on. So the podcast is a totally different animal and totally irrelevant to this conversation. However, now you know there's a podcast, you should probably go listen. So we want to make sure whatever we do, sustainable, okay? Look, I know that this has like been quick. I've gone through all these different things relatively fast, but it's not that complicated. The complication comes when we don't tell ourselves the truth about what we're doing, right? That's where it gets complicated. When I think what I'm doing is okay because I genuinely care, that's why I'm doing it. If you love me, you do this for me. So if you hear those words inside your head, you could be dealing with some codependency. So reach out to whoever you reach out to. Drop us a message if you want to talk about this or work on something like this. Feel free to contact us at any time about this or anything else that we're doing. We're absolutely interested in hearing your feedback. Yeah, so anyway, thank you for joining us again. Sorry for talking way too long about this, but Godspeed and take care of yourselves out there.